The months of practice outside the town had turned the surrounding plains into a scarred testing ground. Arthur and Lori had been experimenting with the limits of their connection, the way she could tap into his reserves to amplify her natural affinity for fire. Sora, meanwhile, remained the steadying anchor, deepening her own mastery of elven scripts. While still limited to lightning and healing, she had evolved. With Arthur's guidance, she used her lightning not just to strike, but to flash melt stone or weave electromagnetic fields into shields that could repel incoming spells. Lori, however, was a different story, a volatile force of nature. She preferred wide-scale destruction, and with Arthur's mana as a fuel source, her custom-written scripts turned the plains into a canvas of scorched earth. The true danger had revealed itself when Arthur suggested mixing fire with a wind tornado. The result was a firestorm that left the ground molten. "It's a good thing we're in the middle of nowhere," Arthur remarked, watching the heat haze shimmer over the charred grass. Sora leaned on her staff, glancing at Lori, who was currently clinging to Arthur's arm like a giddy child. "She has too much power for her lack of self-control," Sora noted dryly. Lori just grinned, pressing closer. "The transfer works best with contact," she chirped, clearly enjoying the excess mana flooding through her. Or Arthur, she couldn't tell. One day, after a particularly grueling session, Lori wouldn't let it go. She begged Arthur to demonstrate a spell of his own, the kind he cast without tomes, chants, or conduits. Arthur usually refused, and Sora was strictly opposed, but Lori's persistence finally wore them down. "Just be careful," Sora warned, her voice tight. "Don't destroy the planet." Lori froze, her eyes widening. She looked from Sora to Arthur. "You can do that?" she asked, clearly believing it possible. "No," Arthur said firmly. "Yes," Sora whispered at the same time. Arthur didn't argue. He quickly cast a reinforced barrier around both women. "What are you going to do?" Sora asked, concern etched on her face. Lori was jumping in place, clapping her hands. "This is going to be great." Arthur ignored them, his expression hardening as he turned toward the open plains. He paused, then flicked his wrist. Magical chains erupted from the earth, wrapping around Sora and Lori's waists and ankles, anchoring them firmly to the bedrock. "Arthur," Sora gasped, feeling the cold, unbreakable grip of the chains. "Just in case," he said, his voice dropping an octave. He raised his right hand, focusing on a point in the distance. He manifested a small, spherical barrier precisely where he was aiming, then ignited a supernova-level explosion inside it, simultaneously forcing the energy to compress. The light was instant. It flared with such terrifying intensity that it outshone the noon sun, turning the world into a stark, shadowless void. Then it collapsed. When the light vanished, the sun felt dim by comparison. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a black that appeared in the distance, a pinprick of absolute nothingness. The ground beneath it began to vanish. It didn't explode. It was pulled upward, the very earth tearing itself apart and streaming into the singularity. Arthur had synthesized a black hole, a feat of physics he'd only ever read about in his past life. The wind picked up, a gale force roar whipping past them at incredible speeds. The chains holding Sora and Lori went taut, straining against the immense gravitational tug. "Arthur, maybe this wasn't a good idea," Lori yelled, her voice barely audible over the screaming wind. Arthur looked back, his own expression shifting from curiosity to genuine alarm. "Small ones aren't supposed to last this long." "This is a small one," Sora shouted back. The three of them were lifted off the ground, their feet trailing in the air as they were yanked toward the void. Only the magical chains and Arthur's barrier held them against the pull. For a long, agonizing minute, the world hung in the balance, the singularity tearing the horizon to shreds, before it finally flickered and dissipated into nothingness. The sudden loss of tension sent Arthur, Sora, and Lori crashing to the ground in a heap of tangled limbs and heavy, gasping breaths. The plains were silent once more, save for the sound of their own heartbeats. The group struggled to their feet, their ears still ringing from the sudden, jarring silence. Lori and Sora exchanged a look, then turned their gaze toward Arthur, who was already brushing dust from his clothes. "In my defense," Arthur started, an immediate justification on his tongue, but Lori cut him off. "You really could destroy the planet," she said, her voice unusually small. Her eyes were wide, fixed on him, with a depth of realization that made Arthur uncomfortable. "Let's check the damage," Arthur replied, eager to move on. He didn't want to fuel their growing perception of his power. His own conscience provided enough ego-checking as it was. He led the way, his boots crunching over the scorched, glass-like earth toward the center of the devastation. "Let's not try that spell again, Arthur," Sora said, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches as she tried to steady her nerves. When they reached the edge of the deep, jagged crater, they stopped dead. The explosion had stripped away layers of earth and centuries of sediment. Embedded halfway down the crater wall, stark and imposing against the raw stone, was a massive granite door. Deep, intricate grooves were carved across its surface, and within those channels, a faint, rhythmic blue light pulsed like a slow heartbeat. "A lost dungeon," Lori whispered, her previous giddiness replaced by a sharp, academic focus. Sora stepped forward, her hand instinctively hovering near her ring. "I thought those were just a myth. People talk about them in legends, but they're supposed to be confined to the deep foundations of the ancient capitals." She stared at the door, her brow furrowed, trying to reconcile the impossible geography. What are the chances of a lost dungeon just showing up right where you cast your spell? Arthur felt a familiar, unwelcome tightness in his chest. He didn't like the implication that he had somehow uncovered something that was meant to stay hidden. "It could have been any one of us," he said, waving a hand toward the wall as if to dismiss the coincidence. "The terrain here is unstable. We just happened to scrape off the right layer of dirt." Sora wasn't buying it. She looked at the door, then back at him, her expression hardening with skepticism. "Lori has been blowing holes in the ground for a couple of months, Arthur. We've carved out trenches and leveled hills for the town's expansion, and none of that ever unearthed a sealed vault. This isn't just a random discovery." Arthur stood silent, the hum of the door vibrating against the soles of his boots. Arthur exhaled, his gaze fixed on the imposing granite barrier. "This isn't something we should rush," he murmured, his hands already beginning to move with practiced, fluid precision. He didn't want the crater to remain a dangerous, exposed pit. He reached out, his will rippling through the earth. With a low, grinding roar, the scorched crater walls began to shift and reform. He channeled his mana into the bedrock, shaping it into two grand, sweeping flights of stone stairs that descended along the sides of the crater, leading directly to the threshold of the door. Above the stairs, he molded the surrounding plains, raising the soil and hardening it until the area was enclosed by a stout, unassuming stone structure, a single building meant to conceal the entrance and protect the stairs from the harsh elements of the plains. Lori and Sora watched in silence as the earth obeyed his command, the chaotic wound in the land transforming into a deliberate, architectural feature. "Let's hold off on this for now," Arthur said, turning away from the new stone structure. "I want to do some research, check the old records, look into what these runes actually signify before we try to open it." Lori, despite her earlier giddiness, nodded solemnly. The sheer scale of the discovery had tempered her usual impulsiveness. Sora also agreed, her eyes lingering on the sealed entrance with a look of deep, scholarly apprehension. "Agreed," Sora said. "Whatever's behind that door, we need to be prepared for it." With the site secured and hidden beneath the new stone building, the three of them turned their backs on the dungeon and began the trek back to the village. The plains felt different now, the air thinner, the silence heavier, as they walked toward the bustling lights of the town, leaving the ancient, pulsing secret buried safely behind its granite face. The village's expansion was nothing short of miraculous. Arthur's stone golems became a common sight, their rhythmic, heavy footsteps echoing as they worked in tandem with the demi-humans and the new elven arrivals. The once bleak plains had been transformed. Arthur had subtly raised the terrain in key sections, landscaping the area to provide better drainage and aesthetics, including the now decorative stone water tower that presided over the settlement like a silent guardian. News of the sanctuary had a way of traveling. Over the course of 6 months, word spread of a place where demi-humans, foxfolk, rabbit folk, and others could live without fear. Rumors of elven knights patrolling the perimeter added a layer of legitimacy that drew more refugees in. What had started as a 10-house cluster had swelled into a small, bustling town. Arthur had begun organizing the labor force, matching tasks to innate abilities. The elven knights, once resentful of their exile, had found a new purpose, taking up the mantle of town guards with a professional, terrifying efficiency. Yet, Arthur knew their current model was unsustainable. He couldn't keep warping to the capital every time they needed fresh cloth or grain. While small hunting and foraging parties were beginning to yield results, they were still heavily dependent on his diminishing reserves from Etherport. He stood in the center of the growing town, watching a group of rabbitfolk children play near the central stone-lined canal. The complexity of managing such a diverse and rapidly growing population was beginning to weigh on him. He needed a more robust economic foundation, a way to manufacture goods rather than just importing them. He turned his attention toward the town's northern edge, where the next expansion phase was planned. He had been considering new construction methods using local materials, hoping that if he could just get the infrastructure stabilized, the settlement would eventually become self-sufficient enough to survive without his constant intervention. The scene shifts to the Demon Lord, standing in front of the small stone entrance Arthur had erected over the dungeon door. He had tried twice now to get Arthur to lose control to the corruption of power. Not only that, Arthur had nearly wiped out the entire population of his agents, coming awfully close to destroying the capital in the process. If not for that girl Sora and her reckless actions, Arthur would have done just that. He stood before the entrance, his eyes tracing the clean, precise lines of Arthur's earth-shaping. A thin, knowing smile touched his lips. "I see you found another way to entertain me, Arthur," the Demon Lord mused, his voice carrying no echo in the empty space. "How will you handle this?" As he phases through the door without effort, descending the stone stairs into the cool, subterranean dark, the Demon Lord pauses before the massive, rune-engraved granite door. The air here is heavy, vibrating with an ancient, suppressed magic. He raises a pale, slender finger, tracing the glowing blue lines of the seal. As he moves, he leaves behind small traces of his own corrupted mana. The dungeon door moans under his touch, the sound akin to tectonic plates grinding against one another. Fissures spider web across the granite, and the blue light within the runes flares into a violent, unstable violet. From the other side, a low, guttural chattering begins to rise, the sound of long-starved, maddened entities sensing a rift. "That should do it. Now we wait," the Demon Lord whispers, a hungry look in his eyes. He warps away, dissolving back into the void of his own castle. He doesn't want the door to burst open just yet. Arthur will surely feel the mana disturbance rippling across the plains and feel compelled to investigate. By the time the seal finally breaks, the dungeon creatures, already driven into a frenzy by the Demon Lord's lingering mana traces, will be a cohesive, bloodthirsty swarm, perfectly positioned to overwhelm the unprepared sanctuary. Arthur stood in his workshop, Lori clinging to his arm like a lost kitten, her presence a constant, warm distraction. Sora, making no effort to hide the jealousy etched into her features, held a long pole tied to a rope that was currently looped around Arthur's waist. He was attempting to harness electricity, a feat he hadn't yet achieved in this world. "And why am I doing this again?" Sora asked, keeping a wary distance. Arthur didn't look up from his workbench. "Because if this goes wrong, I might not be able to break the connection. Someone will need to pull me away. And you," he added, glancing at Lori, "will fry right along with me if you don't let go." Lori didn't budge. She simply squeezed Arthur's arm tighter. "I'm good right here." Sora's eyes narrowed as she looked at the princess. Maybe she'll come to associate you with pain. A few zaps might do her some good. "Hey," Lori retorted, pouting up at Sora. "That's not very nice." Arthur ignored the bickering, focusing entirely on the device before him. He had realized that mana stones themselves remained dormant unless acted upon. He had constructed a lever-actuated housing, an enclosed cylinder lined with magnetite, with a central metal rod wrapped in thin, crude copper wire. He had hooked the rod to a small wool set on the bench. If his theory of electromagnetic induction held, the setup should spin. He carefully lowered the lever, bringing a charged mana stone toward the flat end of the cylinder, where a lightning affinity script was intricately carved. He glanced at Sora. "Be ready. I'm about to start." Sora gripped the pole with both hands, her posture tense, ready to yank Arthur and the clinging princess to safety if the mana output turned lethal. Arthur lowered the lever the rest of the way. As the mana stone entered the activation range, the script flared to life, feeding a current into the copper coils. The magnetic field snapped into existence, interacting violently with the magnetite and forcing the central rod to rotate. The attached wheel on the table began to spin. "It works!" Lori shouted, so startled by the sudden mechanical motion that she shrieked. The outburst caused Sora to jump back in shock, reflexively yanking the rope hard. The sudden jerk pulled Arthur off balance, and he crashed to the floor, dragging Lori down with him. She finally let go, watching the two of them tumble into the dust. Lori jumped right back up, leaving Arthur on the ground. "Sorry, Arthur," Sora said, rushing over to help Arthur up. "So?" Lori asked, pointing at the wheel as it continued to hum and spin. "What is this supposed to do?" "Work," Arthur said, simply, as he brushed himself off. "We can use this to grind grain, or build carriages that don't need beasts to pull them. They'll move on their own. That's just the tip of the possibilities." He reached up and lifted the lever, pulling the mana stone out of range. The script darkened, and the wheel slowed to a halt. He smiled, his mind already racing through the implications of automated manufacturing and transportation. "Let's go wash up and eat," Arthur suggested, looking at the two women. "I think we can call this a success." The warmth of the newly opened pub, filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of mugs, was a stark comfort that Arthur was just beginning to appreciate. He sat at a sturdy wooden table, his hands moving animatedly as he traced the blueprints of a bat-inspired wing onto a scrap of parchment, explaining the principles of lift for a wing to a rapt Sora and a giggling Lori. "It's about air pressure," Arthur said, his eyes bright with the thrill of innovation. "If we can create a shape that forces air to move faster over the top than the bottom, the difference in pressure literally pulls the craft into the sky. And for the cars, it's just a controlled explosion, repeated thousands of times a minute, pushing a piston." Sora frowned, her hand resting on the staff she kept in her ring. "An explosion inside a metal box? Arthur, that sounds like a recipe for a disaster, not transport." Lori just leaned against his shoulder, her gaze fixed more on Arthur's face than his drawings. "I'd ride in it, as long as you were driving." The light-hearted mood was shattered when the pub door swung open with a violent thud. One of the elven guards, his armor dusty and his face white as a sheet, scanned the room with panicked eyes until he locked onto Arthur. He didn't wait for permission. He sprinted to the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Sir, we have a major problem," the guard choked out, saluting frantically. Arthur raised a hand. "Slow down. What happened?" he asked. "One of our long-range patrols just returned. They've spotted an army, a massive one, approaching from the east. They're a few days' ride away." Arthur's hand stopped mid-gesture. The blueprints were forgotten. "Etherport?" he asked, referencing the major power to the south. The elf shook his head vigorously. "No, sir. It's not Etherport. Their insignia, we didn't recognize it. It's a coalition force from the eastern kingdoms." Arthur felt a chill creep up his spine. He had naively assumed that because the primary regional power to the south remained neutral, the other kingdoms would follow suit. He had underestimated the sheer, visceral hatred the world held for a sovereign nation of demihumans. "How many?" Arthur asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. The guard swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "My lieutenant and I, we observed from the ridge for an hour. If we had to guess, sir, 100,000, maybe more. It's a march of total war." The pub seemed to shrink around them. The chatter of the other patrons faded into a dull, meaningless background noise. Arthur slowly looked up, meeting Sora's eyes, then Lori's. "Didn't see this one coming," Arthur said, his voice devoid of his usual optimism. 100,000 troops. They aren't coming to negotiate, and they aren't coming to tax us." The three of them sat in suffocating silence. The blueprint of the airplane, meant to represent a future of freedom and progress, now looked like a cruel, impossible dream. They had only a few days to turn a town of refugees into a fortress, or prepare to watch their sanctuary be turned to ash. If you enjoy these stories, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help this channel grow so I can continue to improve and provide a wide variety of stories. Thanks for watching.